Hello, Internet, and thank you very much for tuning into the Cloud Native FM podcast. Data fuels tomorrow's economies, AI, and national security. But who controls that data? Today, we are talking about digital sovereignty, a topic that is missing in this YouTube channel, and now we're actually covering it. We're talking about digital sovereignty, how companies, communities, and governments can control of their digital destiny while still innovating. And my guest is Gabriel Gaura, Head of Infrastructure, Security, and Risk at T-System International Cloud Professional Services. Gabriel leads infrastructure and security practices at scale and help organizations navigate infrastructure, compliance, and security challenges. So, Gabriel, welcome to this show. Could you start by telling our listener a bit about your role and why sovereignty sits on your radar these days?
So the element of sovereignty became quite relevant, especially in our focus as well during last year. Yeah, and I think you can kind of see what was the trigger for that. I think it's the geopolitical situation, right? Especially triggered by United States and the president of the U.S., right? That started quite a lot of I would say pushback and quite a lot of discussion overall in quite a lot of businesses, especially in European Union, about how to handle this. Yeah, so that's the story. This is where we kind of realized that all right, the companies might really need some help in this area because it does pose a new challenge. Or maybe let me revert it. The challenge is old, but the level of risk has been ramped up heavily during last year and continues this year.
Absolutely, 100%. And I think all of the initiative has been actually circle around and innovation is just starting up. I work at the Cloud Native Computing Foundation and we see recently popping up some solution like confidential computing, a bunch of the container kind of stuff. So that's a very resonating subject because as you said, the risk is ramping up quite heavily. And I think a lot of frustration and sometimes a new ways to innovate the existing solution and bring more solution in the table as well. But as you work with the T system, Gabriel, so tell us a little bit about why digital sovereignty is a, you said you talk, why is digital sovereignty is a priority in conversation you having with customers? Like what are their pain point considering compute, network, storage, or what are the one key reason you see there's a lot of frustration and a lot of the innovation happening in the sovereignty?
Yeah. So let me start by I guess the most obvious one, right? That's the geopolitical development of the recent months, and you can also now even say years, right? And it comes with a couple of newly highlighted risks. Let me put it this way, right? What we see, you can cluster these risks into a financial risk, into an operational risk, and into something which could be called like an innovational risk or strategic risk, right? But let me start with the financial risk, right? I think that by now everyone knows what tariffs are and how the U.S. president plays around with tariffs, right? What a lot of people are also now seeing is it's not a one-sided action. There's always a reaction to it. And especially if you're in the European space, right, there's now very open talk by the EU Commission to do reciprocal tariffs on all US software products, which would hit especially every company that is using Azure, Microsoft, Google. 80%, you can see then later on as well, 80% of all the software that's being used by EU companies is not EU-based. Yeah. So just compute that, so to speak. What is the financial risk? So you need to at least, make that part of your calculation of your risk management. Yeah, that's area one. Second area is the operational risk, and this is where things become even more heated. Yeah, we have a wonderful example of a Dutch bank. You can find it in the news as well. But this news is 2 years old now. But it's a beautiful example of how underestimating a vendor lock-in or a vendor risk, that's, by the way, also for the same reason, a geopolitical event, has caused a the bank to simply go bankrupt within a few months, yeah, because they were declined access to their Microsoft Azure cloud because they were not a good partner. I would put it this way, and the specific reason here was they had Russian capital, and there was what we all aware, right, that the war between Ukraine and Russia was triggered a couple of years ago and has been lasting for several years now. That was the trigger, right, for the U.S. government back then under Biden, yeah, that said, all right, anyone that is Russia funded will not have access to our software and our platforms. So they literally cut the bank from one day to another, and they were heavily invested into the Azure platform. Very few backups. They had some high availability setups on site, but not sufficient. And the recovery process and everything connected to it, it took them simply so long. The company was no longer viable after a few months. Yeah, and that's an even bigger risk, financial impact, but even the operational risk. Yeah, and the third one is more of a long-lasting one, but it's also extremely relevant, right? Exposure of intellectual property, exposure of sensitive data, the lack of ability to, in general, be in control, right? And we've kind of skipped that, but for a lot of people, what is actually sovereignty, right? What's the definition of digital sovereignty? It is the ability to exercise control over your IT landscape, over your tech stack, over whatever you want to call that you want to be sovereign on, right? It's the ability to exercise control, right? And this is where, for example, the third risk, yeah, is also showcasing that if you are very heavily locked into a specific vendor or even multiple vendors, right, you kind of hand over the ability to innovate to those vendors because you cannot do anything without them anymore. You're so locked in, right? So it's the standard vendor lock-in dilemma, you know? So that's the third area and third main risk around which companies should really be aware of. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think you're pointing out wonderful things here as well, because as you said, like the sovereignty is become quite recently popular because of these tariff hits. Like, oh, now you actually using our resources, your compute, our networking components, our cloud. Now you have to pay us more. Now not all the company has the infinite amount of money so they can actually invest in there, and that's a very big challenge there. And
it's just a component of overall sovereignty, if you want to think about it. Yeah, so we haven't talked about this yet, so I'll just slowly go into how the market currently views sovereignty. It kind of can be differentiated into three clusters. Let's put it this way, three clusters. They're not completely separate, right? They do flow into each other to a certain extent, but for simplicity's sake, right? Let's say that you have three areas, and it's data sovereignty, it's the operational sovereignty, and it's technological, or a lot of people say compute as well, sovereignty. Yeah. So you kind of have these three areas, and each one is focusing on a different element. Yeah. And like you correctly recognized, right? Data residency, data sovereignty. That element that piece is focusing on where my data is stored, which legal frameworks apply, how is that data accessed, and what control do I exercise over that data? Can someone else grab it and do it with it what he wants? How do I protect the data? What's the compliance element to it? Yeah, because if you are in EU space, right, you need to be aware there's a lot of compliance bits, for a lot of regulatory elements around data. Yeah, GDPR being one of them, but it's not the only one, right? We have, depending on if this industry or that, right? There's a financial industry has DORA, right? Pharma industry has GXP. A lot more, right? If you're in a critical infrastructure business, then it's Kritis, etc., etc. Yeah, so there are quite a few more, but that's another element of how compliance is relevant to sovereignty. But it's not the only thing, right? And when we talk to the companies, and I now diving a little bit deeper into the data sovereignty bit, but when we talk to companies around, okay, so how sovereign you want to be, what's your idea about how sovereign you want to be? There are levels to it. Let's put it this way. First level is kind of a mandatory thing, and that's the compliance bit. That's the regulatory bit, right? Every company needs to fulfill that. It's non-negotiable. Well, it's negotiable unless they don't mind paying fines. Yeah. So that's the first level. But the second level then is really the best practice kind of area, and this is where the geopolitical setup comes into play, right? I think everyone is now aware about the Cloud Act and the Patriot Act. And the reaction to that and the fears in the EU ecosystem is both AWS and Azure, and I think Google will come up with something very soon, but both of these have come up with what they call a European sovereign cloud. Yeah. Now, you even asked me that. How is that not an answer for sovereignty in EU? Not even close. So there are some safeguards in place, but the main safeguard, the main one is it is still a US backed and US owned company, even if they have data centers and personnel in European space. They are still owned, so they still need to be compliant to the Patriot and the Cloud Act. Yeah, that has been proven in front of a court. Yeah, so they basically don't cover for the main fear and main reason why companies are now divesting or looking at other software vendors for their needs. Yeah, so they don't cover the main reason for that. However, they are more sovereign. So let's not be completely biased here. They are more sovereign than their natural or original version. Yeah, for example, like I said, yeah, the data residency is in EU. It's being operated by EU personnel. Yeah, it is subject to EU laws as well. Yeah, so to that level, it is a little bit more advanced, but it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't answer the main fear.
Yes, absolutely. And also, I think as your conversation, I'm thinking like we're now shifting in a different paradigm. Like we have some of the alliance in the back time in there, like you and we are becoming alliance partner with each other. Now we can trust each other and our data can flow and leave our territory, go back to your territory. We can do processing and get it back toward us. Now I'm thinking that the fear is that now my data is leaving my country and there's something bad happened to my data and it will ruin me off quite badly. Might be some enemy in the internet can pick my data and do something bad with it, or even might lose my alliance with such partner and they can sell it my data, and that's where we see a huge frustration about. And there's a term called digital sovereignty recently pop into it. Now, in terms of that, I think is also I see a lot of the company is like say, oh, you have to live in the US or the EU to work with us. That also the major challenge is how to get hired the personnel who working on sun data. And also remember, we are working in open source technologies all the time, and a lot of tooling is coming from the US back open source tooling, and now it's been looking, it is living and shifting in the EU based companies and their stack, and now all the data might go elsewhere, something like that. So now my natural question comes into this picture. I know, and you work with a lot of customers who's using the open source technologies, and open source technology, you have a feedback, you have pushed the data to somewhere else. If some of the companies working on the open source technologies, and now we understand how crucial it is to make sure all the guardrails set for the sovereignty layer, how do you think the open source landscape will be affected out of all of this?
So I cannot be I cannot, or I don't want to do predictions, but once again, right, open source does answer some major challenges around in the sovereignty area, right? Like for example, I think in the meantime everyone is aware what happened to VMware, and through acquisition of Broadcom, how the license policy were adjusted, right? So that cannot happen with open source, right? So that is a major contribution into how, again, we're coming back to the main question: what's the level of control you can exercise over it, and how are you able to react? And this is the element, right? Open source simply doesn't come with the license structures and license policies, yeah, and that's the main advantage of it. It is still possible to be subject to the tariff element, right? Depending if it's, for example, a US-based software. So, like I said, it's much better positioned, but it's not once again, it's not a one shoe size fits all type of setup, right? It doesn't cover for everything. That's why, and we only talked about the data part, right? But there are two other layers of sovereignty, right? And they don't really have to do that much, for example, with how you handle the data. It's more about how is your operation setup, degree to which a customer's organization has transparency over how it's managed overall, the operations, not just data, right? Because a lot of the companies are reliant on or are outsourcing their operations to somewhere else. Yeah, it's a lot of cases the situation, right? And this is where operational sovereignty comes into play, and this is where these service disruptions and the vulnerabilities that can occur are becoming relevant. I think there were a couple of interesting examples, right, where a company has been hacked from the inside. Basically, there was I think a foreign agent was part of the operations team, and he was in. Basically, it was hacked from the inside, right? So that's the operational element bit.
Yes.
Yeah. So that doesn't impact that heavy a lot of other companies if they don't outsource, but also if they still just insource, right? They need to be aware about what safeguards do they have in place in terms of how can that data even physically be accessed. Yeah. How can it be once again misused? Yeah. How can it be tunneled and create or made vulnerable? Right. And that's the operation.
I'm totally agree with you, because I think, like, if you look at it, I think in terms of the timeline for doing all this stuff is very short. I can imagine that it's a very short amount of bandwidth where the government asks you, I don't want you to, I want you to replace everything what we have been doing and make sure that tomorrow when we wake up, everything will become digital sovereign. It's look good in theory, in practice, it can excite all of the people in the community, in the country, but it's a very short time to do all these kind of effort. And as you said, the operational challenges are so much high at the end of the real day. When you have network, compute, and storage set up, the most thing you do from day 10 or day 20 is the operational things, and you make sure that the operational things are sovereign. Otherwise, whatever your logic and the infrastructure you have built up, you will lose, because your operational challenges are not equipped with the sovereignty. And
exactly. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you have. I think you have some good things to add. Go ahead.
No. I was just about. No, I just wanted to add basically, right, that look, that these things are interconnected. The pillars, or the clusters, they are interconnected, right?
Yes.
They're not a standalone. So, for example, you can say that I'm perfectly sovereign in my data sovereignty, so my data is untouched and I'm good, and I have all my sovereignty problems solved. Well, not really, right?
Yes.
So you are sovereign to a certain level, but you are still exposed to risks. Yeah, and those risks could be quantified and should be quantified by the companies. They should be expressed, and you need to have, or the companies simply need to have a strategy, a contingency strategy, or directly maybe even change something, right? But that's the bit, right? These two things are, and three, apologies, we get to the technological sovereignty in a bit, but they are interconnected. Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely, 100%. I think from all of these conversation, because as we both know, and everybody listening to us, the timing of all of this doing this is a very short. We can imagine this, how much of the stress and the eagerness and the fastness the government and the companies need to make sure that we have all these things are placed. But the timing is short. So are you looking at it like from the third party vendor perspective, even in the T system? So the both AWS, Microsoft have pledged, as you called during the conversation, provide all Europe with a sovereign cloud, the sovereignty cloud for all of their need. But what do alternative we have as the third party companies, and what does the T system or the companies like these offer for their customer to become digitally sovereign from the next year and beyond?
So as you can imagine, right, as a reaction to the the pressures and the geopolitical setup, right? A lot of companies and even EU itself and a lot of governments are now, well, not just realizing it, they are into let's do something about it stage. Yeah, which
Yes.
means that I think you saw also that there's a huge invest from EU Commission itself to come up with a alternative to the big American vendors or Chinese vendors clouds, right? It's the Aura initiative, right? And they're trying to build now a huge edge cloud continuum, yeah. And that's just to name one, right? But there's a lot more invest from every side, from all sides, basically flowing into this. Yeah. Well, luckily, in T-Systems and Deutsche Telekom, we've had a couple of platforms already running for quite a while. We just didn't position them as sovereign, right? Because that wasn't an angle that a lot of companies looked at, right? So basically, there are multiple ways how you can address it. Yeah. So once again, it all depends on how sovereign you want to be and what's your current impact. Yeah. So I'll firstly name, we have platforms that are an amazing alternative, whether we talk about a public cloud or a private cloud. But I think the customers are looking mostly at alternatives to public cloud, right? Because this is where the ecosystem is flooded with either US or Chinese platforms and softwares, right? So we're looking mostly at alternatives in this area. And this is where, for example, our T-Cloud Public is an amazing offering that's been in place for several years. We have more than 4,000 customers running on it. We even had confirmations that we have around 80% functionality covered compared to the AWS and Azure, right? So also on a functionality level, it's extremely comparable, right? And then it fulfills, of course, the data element. It fulfills the operational element. Technological sovereignty, we haven't gotten to that part because that's right. Like you cannot really be completely technologically independent or in the EU ecosystem when it comes to hardware, right? I think we all know, and especially your audience knows, right? There are not a lot of hardware vendors in the European space, right? But on the software side of things, that's a different tune, right? And this is where, once again, we can be a lot more. So the T-Cloud Public is built on open source as well. Yeah, so I think this is also an important element that we need to be aware of. So that's on the platform side of things, right? But as I said, yeah, it's not as simple as, hey, here is a more sovereign cloud, buy it and you're all good. Right? That's not how it is. Yeah. So like I said, a lot of companies are in a different situation, right? They have different ownership structure. They are international. They have plants in US, in China. Some are only local here. Yeah. They have different strategies. Some are heavily in public cloud. Some are already multi-cloud. So you have such a variation of possible impacts and how sovereignty can impact your company. That is very difficult to say. There's one answer like, hey, do this and you're more sovereign. Yeah, there are some general guidelines how to become more sovereign, right? But like I said, and what we haven't talked about is with sovereignty, you unfortunately get a trade-off. Yeah, trade-off usually on functionality, trade-off usually on price as well.
Yes.
Yeah. So once again, we come to the point that being completely sovereign is also not an option for a lot of companies, right?
Yes.
So it's the so to speak golden path, right? To realize where you need to be more sovereign, where the impact is the highest, where your risk appetite is very low, and you don't want to be exposed at all. And then there are areas, right, where it's okay. I just want a contingency plan, yeah, and I have that plan ready in my drawer, and I'm able to pull it out if the trigger happens, yeah. So once again, it's a different situation for a lot of companies, right? And this is where we in T-Systems can basically help and navigate, right? So the first step on the journey, and you can see it also a little bit on the screen, is basically realizing what the problem is before you can face it. Yeah, so that's something like exposure analysis, where and we all have to be aware that it's not just an IT problem. Sovereignty is not just an IT problem, right? It's also a governance problem. It's a procurement problem, right? Because sovereignty impacts quite heavily your vendor structure, right, and your vendor mechanisms, yeah, your procurement setups. So it's also, there's also this element, yeah. So the first part is really taking a look at where you are right now and how exposed you are, and what your risk appetite and risk profile is for each of these elements. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
What,
And as you said, rightly for if so, because going all the way from zero rank to 100% sovereign is might not be trivial for you, because it can spark skyrocketing your all of the things you've been done. The cost become a bigger challenge for that angle is that are your customer gonna pay for all these kind of sovereign thing? It is another big challenge. I think that having a pragmatic setup is a very important, and I think as the appetite and as the stress and as the movement is pushing us this sovereignty, I believe most people will forget the pragmatic guide and will go all the way to the 100% sovereignty.
yeah, there are companies and there are entities, especially in the government sector, right, that are now kind of like pivot 180%, right, or 180 degrees, and just go in full sovereignty, which is it's a strategy, right? Look, I think that they did at least address the problem. You need to at least have a strategy. You need to at least be aware of how do I want to face it, right? And then, of course, you need to realize what the impact is, and then you create a kind of like a roadmap to it, yeah. And that's the important part, right? In the roadmap, in to become more sovereign, you're looking at really at the trade-offs that I mentioned. This makes sense. This doesn't make sense. This is the impact, because a lot of the changes, you know, for example, if you really want to change platform, that's extremely disruptive. Yeah, not a lot of workloads are portable. Yeah, so it's not that easy to change, and even and especially if you become more cloud native, yeah, like for example, PaaS services by Azure, or even serverless, yeah, concepts. It's even harder than to get out of these services, because it's embedded almost in the application code, right? Yeah. How you work with these services on a platform level. So it's even more challenging. So that's why I'm coming back to, don't change completely from 1 to 100%, because the disruption and the cost is immeasurable. Yeah,
absolutely.
So what you need to start is really realizing, this is my problem. This is how I, in general, want to solve the sovereignty problem. And now let's build a plan. Let's build a roadmap. In some cases, I change something now. In some cases, I just want the contingency scenario in place. Yeah, and a lot of the times, it's also something like, hey, did I address that risk? Because it's also there's a risk element to it. Yeah, and now if some of the CIOs and CFOs want to, pardon my French, cover their backs, you know, one of the ways supervisory boards can check that is, hey, and so by the way, what did you do to make us more sovereign? How did you address that risk? Yeah, and you can tell, yeah, okay, we actually did spend some time on it.
Yes.
We at least checked, you know, this is how exposed we are, and we do have a plan. If we need to trigger it, yeah, maybe it's a plan. Maybe we already are doing something about it, because
absolutely. And I think living in a security world, I think a lot of the people who live in the security world, they understand this. They previously have a scoring mechanism. Like previously we have 0, and now we move into the 0 to 2, and now we want to 2 from the 5, and our future plan should be 10 out of 9 to 8. So that would be the criteria here, rather than pushing everything into. And I think this is not a feasible, because a lot of the development has been done for all of the application. Even though you pull all the foundational layer and swap it into the sovereign layer, but the rest of the code that's written on top of that foundation layer, they are not sovereign by any mean. Their operational challenges are not sovereign in mean. So impacting those will affect your customers. And rightfully so, if you affect your customer, so the business kind of shifted in these uncircumstances, and you don't want your already running customer will be affected from all of this. So I wish that there should be a strategy in place. Otherwise, all of this will be becoming, we go from the more sovereign, rather
Yeah.
than we fixing all the code that we written for the last 25 years and no innovation been happening. So I don't want this to be another.
On the innovation bit, I was doing a different podcast the other day, and my answer to that was like, how does innovation look like versus sovereignty, right? And if you think about it this way, right? Historically, innovation usually happened in scarcity.
Yes.
Basically, innovation happens when you're pushed against the wall, right? And if you think about it, sovereignty is kind of being pushed to a corner, and finding a way out of it. So a lot of these services, a lot of these mechanisms that are now being created that are becoming more sovereign, is a very innovative and creative way how to solve that. Yeah.
Yes.
So you can see actually quite a lot of innovation on the basis of this threat of not being able to be in the comfort zone and have everything from Microsoft. Yeah, and pardon Microsoft that I'm taking as an example, but they do really have an amazing end-to-end concept, right? Everything is interconnected, from SharePoints to productivity to connectivity to platforms. Beautiful setup, right? But like I said, you kind of in a comfort zone, and you give away your innovation power. You give away your ability to control when something happens, and this is where a lot of companies are realizing, all right, that might not be the best option. And some of the customers that I talked to in the past was vendor lock-in was actually not a problem; it was their strategy.
Yes,
because it simplified things. Yeah,
absolutely.
It was amazing to hear some of these. Yeah, and like I said, yeah, it's not that decision was wrong, maybe partially, but it wasn't completely wrong some years ago. But right now the situation is different, and you have to adapt, yeah, to the current setup.
Yes, 100%, as you mentioned wonderfully, because some people look for the simplicity, but now the geopolitical scenes are changing. So I don't think anybody has this leverage to stay where they are. Sovereignty is the challenge. They need to solve it. The time is ticking. Everybody has their deadline to do it. And I think that there's a initial push might break or make people more brave. So I think the bravery and the braveness will work side by side while moving this into the conversation as well. But thank you very much, Gabriel. I think we definitely do an episode 2 on that, because the topic in itself is quite vast. And I believe it's a very right time, end of 2025 and moving into the 2026. And this conversation should be in the organization tables or the enterprises table. And luckily now we have a wonderful guest in front of me who understand this tipping point and also had some customer experience in the back in the day who's telling us. So thank you very much, Gabriel. It's wonderful listening and hearing your stories about that as well. And I think we definitely add more into the conversation table as well. So if you have some question, please give us on the YouTube chart description, and we will be hearing you what actually been hitting you most in the digital sovereignty layer as well. Thanks for listening to this podcast, and make sure there's more episode with Gabriel launching soon in this channel as well. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.